The most powerful person in our family was not the one whose name appeared on the company buildings. It was the one nobody dared to disagree with. Growing up, I believed the Harrison family was untouchable. People in our town spoke about us the way they spoke about old landmarks, as if we had always existed and always would. Our family owned businesses, properties, and enough influence to make people lower their voices when discussing us in public. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Every holiday gathering appeared elegant. Every charity event seemed flawless. Every family photograph looked like proof that success could last forever. But the older I became, the more I realized that perfection inside our family came with a price. My name is Ethan Harrison, and for as long as I can remember, there was one person who controlled the atmosphere in every room she entered. Victoria never raised her voice. She never needed to. People adjusted themselves around her automatically. My father, David, was supposed to be the heir to the family legacy, yet even he seemed careful whenever she spoke. Isabel always supported Victoria's opinions before anyone else had the chance to respond. Thomas, our longtime family attorney, treated her observations as though they carried legal authority. Even Eleanor, who knew more about our family history than anyone alive, often remained silent when Victoria was present. Then there was Harrison. He sat at the edge of every gathering wearing old denim shirts that looked completely out of place among expensive suits and designer dresses. Most guests assumed he was some distant relative nobody cared about. Yet I noticed something strange. While everyone appeared eager to impress Victoria, they also watched Harrison. Not openly, not obviously, but they watched him. It was as if his reaction mattered more than his words. One rainy Sunday evening, the entire family gathered inside the massive dining room of the estate. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished wood. The fireplace glowed softly at one end of the room. Outside, rain rolled down the tall windows overlooking the grounds. Victoria sat confidently near the center of the table. Conversation flowed exactly where she wanted it to go. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody challenged her. Nobody even changed the subject without her approval. As I watched the room, I realized something unsettling. This was not a family dinner. It felt more like a courtroom where everyone already knew the verdict. Then, for the briefest moment, I saw Harrison smile. It was small, almost invisible, but it happened immediately after Victoria made a comment about loyalty. And somehow, that tiny smile made me wonder whether the most powerful woman in our family was not nearly as secure as everyone believed. The morning after that dinner, I could not stop thinking about the way everyone had reacted to Victoria. It was not respect. At least, not entirely. Respect usually comes with comfort. What I saw around that table looked more like caution. The Harrison estate came alive early. Staff moved through the halls. Deliveries arrived at the service entrance. Garden crews maintained the grounds stretching across more than 50 acres. From a distance, everything appeared orderly, predictable. Yet beneath that polished routine, there seemed to be an invisible set of rules that nobody ever discussed. During breakfast, I decided to pay closer attention. David sat at the far end of the table reading financial reports. Isabel reviewed notes for an upcoming charity event. Eleanor quietly stirred her coffee while staring out the window. Harrison remained near the fireplace with a newspaper resting on his lap. Then Victoria entered the room. The atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations paused for a fraction of a second before resuming. Chairs shifted. People adjusted themselves without realizing it. Victoria smiled warmly and greeted everyone. To an outsider, nothing would have seemed unusual, but once I noticed the pattern, I could not stop seeing it. Later that afternoon, I accompanied David to one of the family's office buildings downtown. Officially, he was the future leader of the Harrison Empire. Employees treated him with respect. Executives sought his approval. Yet during a meeting about a major property investment, something caught my attention. Whenever an important decision approached, people looked toward Victoria. Not David. She was not even leading the meeting. She simply sat quietly near the window reviewing documents. Still, everyone waited for her reaction before speaking. On the drive back to the estate, I asked my father a simple question. Why does everyone listen to Victoria? David kept his eyes on the road. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he answered in a way that only deepened my curiosity. Some people spend their lives building influence. Others inherit it. It was not really an answer. It was a warning. That evening, another gathering filled the mansion with guests. Politicians, business leaders, and longtime family associates moved through the grand rooms. Victoria welcomed them effortlessly. She seemed to know exactly what everyone wanted to hear. Across the room, Harrison stood alone near a bookshelf, ignored by almost everyone. Yet when I looked closely, I noticed something strange. More than once, Victoria glanced toward him, not with confidence, not with affection, with concern. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether the most powerful woman in the family was watching Harrison for the same reason everyone else did. Because she knew something about him that nobody was supposed to know. The question followed me everywhere after that evening. Why was Harrison still here? Nobody seemed to like him. Nobody included him in important conversations. Nobody treated him as though he held any real authority. Yet year after year, he remained at the center of the family's orbit. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. A few days later, the estate hosted a fundraising luncheon attended by local business leaders and longtime family associates. Events like these were part of the Harrison tradition. The mansion always looked impressive. Fresh flowers filled the hallways. Staff moved efficiently between guests. Expensive artwork lined the walls. Everything projected stability and success. As usual, Victoria managed the room effortlessly. She greeted donors by name, introduced influential guests to one another, and seemed to anticipate every conversation before it happened. Most people naturally gathered around her. Harrison did the opposite. He stayed near the back of the library, standing beside a bookshelf with a coffee cup in his hand. Very few guests approached him. Most barely acknowledged him at all. Yet something unusual happened several times throughout the afternoon. Whenever a new guest arrived, their eyes eventually drifted toward Harrison. Not with recognition, not with curiosity, with caution. It was subtle, but once I noticed it, I could not stop seeing it. Later, while helping James move several boxes of archived documents into storage, I finally asked the question that had been bothering me. Why is Harrison still part of this family? James nearly dropped the folder he was holding. For a moment, he looked genuinely surprised. Then he glanced down the empty hallway before answering. Some people stay because they belong. Others stay because they cannot be removed. That was all he said. Before I could ask another question, he carried the boxes into a nearby room and closed the door. The answer made no sense. That evening, I found myself watching Harrison more closely during dinner. He spoke only twice during the entire meal. Neither comment seemed important. Yet every time he opened his mouth, the table became noticeably quieter. Even Victoria paused briefly before continuing the conversation. It was as though everyone was measuring his reaction. Then something happened that I could not explain. A young employee accidentally brought the wrong folder into the dining room and placed it beside Victoria. The moment Harrison noticed the folder, his expression changed. Just slightly. Victoria saw it too. Without hesitation, she removed the folder from the table and handed it back to the employee. Their eyes met for less than a second. But in that second, I saw something I had never seen before. Victoria was not controlling the moment. She was responding to it. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Harrison was not merely an outsider sitting at the edge of the family. He might be the one person in the room who understood exactly how the entire system worked. The following week brought the first real crack in the image the family had spent years protecting. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon inside the executive offices attached to one of our largest commercial properties. I was helping organize archived financial files for David when I noticed a document that did not belong in the folder where it had been placed. At first, it seemed insignificant. A routine trust review, the kind of paperwork nobody paid attention to. But one detail immediately stood out. The document referenced a family asset that I had never heard discussed before. The property itself was not unusual. What caught my attention was the ownership structure. Several names appeared throughout the file. David, Victoria, Thomas, a series of legal entities connected to the family. Then there was a section that looked different from the rest. Certain lines appeared to have been amended years after the original document had been created. I was not an attorney, but even I could tell something had changed. Before I could examine it further, David entered the office. The moment he saw the file in my hands, his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. "That folder should be with legal," he said. His voice sounded calm, but there was tension beneath it. "Do you know what it is?" I asked. He hesitated. "No, and neither do you." Then he took the document and placed it inside his briefcase. The conversation ended there. Later that evening, I could not stop thinking about the file. If David truly knew nothing about it, why react so quickly? If he did know something, why pretend otherwise? The questions followed me back to the estate. After dinner, I found Sophia working in the library. She occasionally assisted Thomas with research and document management, which made her one of the few people I trusted to speak honestly. Without mentioning names, I described what I had seen. Sophia listened carefully before asking a simple question. Did the amendments benefit the same people who controlled the original asset? I thought about the document. No. She leaned back in her chair. Then, that is not a revision. That is a transfer of power. The words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. Near midnight, I walked through the dark hallway leading toward the family library. As I approached the doorway, I heard voices inside. One belonged to Thomas. The other belonged to Victoria. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough to understand the subject. They were discussing a document. The same document. Then Victoria said something that made me stop walking entirely. If Ethan starts asking the wrong questions, Harrison will know we missed something. For the first time, I realized the document was not the problem. The problem was that someone was afraid it still existed. After overhearing Victoria and Thomas in the library, I stopped treating my suspicions like imagination. For the first time, I had proof that certain conversations were happening behind closed doors, and more importantly, that my questions had already attracted attention. The next few days felt different. Not because anyone confronted me. Quite the opposite. Everyone behaved as though nothing had changed. Victoria remained composed. Thomas continued handling legal matters. David buried himself in work. Yet the more carefully I watched, the more obvious the pattern became. Decisions that appeared spontaneous somehow benefited the same people every time. Opportunities flowed in predictable directions. Information traveled through invisible channels. It was like watching a machine operate beneath the surface of family life. One afternoon, Sophia called and asked if I could meet her at a private conference room inside Thomas's law office. When I arrived, several old trust summaries were spread across the table. She pointed to a series of dates spanning nearly 20 years. "Look at who signs these documents," she said. At first, I focused on the attorneys and trustees. Then I noticed something else. Different names appeared over the years, but one influence remained constant. Every major revision seemed connected to recommendations that ultimately traced back to Victoria. Not directly, never directly, always through committees, advisors, or legal reviews. The structure was sophisticated enough to avoid attention. "She built this slowly," Sophia said. "Very slowly." The realization unsettled me. I had always assumed the family fortune operated through formal leadership. Instead, it appeared that real authority moved through relationships, obligations, and carefully managed loyalty. That evening, I returned to the estate and found Eleanor sitting alone in the sunroom overlooking the gardens. The setting sun cast long shadows across the floor. For several minutes we watched the grounds in silence. Then she surprised me. "People think power comes from ownership," she said quietly. "They are usually wrong." I asked what she meant. Eleanor looked toward the mansion. "The person who controls the story controls everything else." Before I could respond, she stood and walked away. Later that night, another family dinner filled the great dining room. Crystal glasses reflected the chandelier light. The conversation seemed ordinary. Then Victoria mentioned a future leadership transition inside one of the family companies. Everyone nodded as though the decision had already been made. Everyone except Harrison. He said nothing. He simply looked across the table at Victoria. For the first time, she did not immediately continue speaking. A brief silence settled over the room. In that moment, I understood something important. Victoria controlled the family. But Harrison possessed something she could not fully control. And whatever that was, it frightened her. The question that haunted me most was no longer whether Victoria controlled the family. By then, I was almost certain she did. The real question was why. Influence alone could not explain the tension that appeared whenever Harrison entered a room. Influence alone could not explain the documents, the careful silences, or the way certain topics seemed forbidden. Somewhere beneath all of it was a reason. A few days later, I found it, or at least the first piece of it. Sophia called early in the morning and asked me to meet her at a records archive maintained by the county courthouse. Most of the files stored there were decades old and rarely accessed. We spent hours reviewing property transfers, trust registrations, and historical ownership records connected to the Harrison family. Most of it was exactly what we expected. Then Sophia stopped turning pages. She stared at a single document for several seconds before sliding it across the table. "Look at the date," she said quietly. The document was more than 30 years old. It referenced a succession structure connected to several family holdings. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the file, a name I had never heard before: Andrew Harrison. At first, I assumed he was some distant relative, but the more pages we reviewed, the stranger things became. Andrew was not a minor figure. He was central to everything: future beneficiary, successor, primary heir. The language left little room for interpretation. Whoever Andrew Harrison was, he had once stood at the center of the family's future. Yet nobody had ever mentioned him. Not David, not Eleanor, not Thomas, not even Victoria. It was as if he had been erased. That evening, I returned to the estate with copies of the records hidden inside my briefcase. During dinner, I watched the family carefully. Every face around the table suddenly looked different. Every conversation seemed to conceal something. Then I noticed Harrison studying me from across the room. He knew. Somehow, he knew I had found something important. Later that night, as rain tapped softly against the library windows, I found him sitting alone beside the fireplace. The room glowed with amber light from the flames. Before I could say a word, Harrison looked directly at me and nodded toward the folder in my hands. "So you found Andrew." My heart nearly stopped. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Harrison leaned back in his chair and stared into the fire. "There was a time when everyone believed this family belonged to him," he said. "Then one day, people started pretending he never existed." I stared at him in disbelief. Who was he? Harrison's expression hardened. "The wrong question." The fire crackled softly between us. Then he spoke again. "The question you should ask is why so many people benefited after he disappeared." After my conversation with Harrison, the atmosphere inside the estate changed in ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. Nobody openly discussed Andrew. Nobody mentioned the records I had discovered. Yet it felt as though an invisible fault line had begun spreading through the family. Small things started happening. David became unusually distracted during meetings. Eleanor spent more time alone in the gardens. Thomas made frequent visits to the estate without any clear explanation. Even Victoria seemed less comfortable than before. She remained confident in public, but I noticed her watching people more carefully, especially Harrison. The tension reached a new level during a weekend gathering at the mansion. Several extended family members arrived for what was supposed to be a routine planning session regarding charitable foundations and future investments. On the surface, everything appeared normal. The dining room was prepared perfectly. Staff moved efficiently through the halls. Guests exchanged polite conversation beneath the glow of the chandeliers. But beneath the polished exterior, something was changing. During a discussion about future leadership roles within the family companies, David unexpectedly challenged one of Victoria's recommendations. The room immediately fell silent. It was not a dramatic disagreement. In fact, David spoke respectfully. Yet the reaction around the table revealed how unusual the moment was. For years, nobody questioned Victoria publicly. Now someone had. Victoria maintained her smile, but her eyes hardened slightly. The conversation moved forward, yet the balance of power felt less certain than before. Later that evening, I found Eleanor sitting alone in the library. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Bookshelves surrounded us on every side. She looked exhausted, older somehow, as though years of silence had finally become too heavy to carry. For several moments, she stared into the fireplace before speaking. "Secrets do not destroy families immediately," she said quietly. "They destroy them slowly, one compromise at a time." I asked whether she was talking about Andrew. Eleanor closed her eyes. For a moment, I thought she might finally answer. Instead, she stood and handed me a small envelope. "If you truly want answers, show this to Sophia." Then she walked away. The envelope contained a single photograph. It showed a younger Eleanor standing beside a young man I immediately recognized from the records. Andrew Harrison. Both were smiling. Both looked completely at ease. Written on the back was a date from more than 30 years earlier and a short message in Eleanor's handwriting. Family is not always determined by who controls the inheritance. When Sophia examined the photograph the next morning, her expression changed instantly. She turned the image over several times before looking directly at me. "Ethan," she said carefully, "I think everyone has been asking the wrong question. The mystery is not where Andrew went. The mystery is who was supposed to replace him." The question Sophia raised followed me back to the estate and stayed with me long after midnight. If Andrew had been removed from the family's future, then someone else must have benefited from his absence. For weeks I had focused on the missing heir. Now I was forced to look at the people who remained. The next morning, Sophia and I began reviewing a timeline built from every document we had collected. Trust revisions, property transfers, board appointments, succession plans. The pattern became clearer with every page. Before Andrew disappeared from family records, the future of the Harrison Empire appeared relatively straightforward. Afterward, authority began shifting through a series of carefully managed decisions. None of them looked suspicious on their own. Together, however, they told a very different story. One name appeared repeatedly at key moments. Victoria, not as a direct beneficiary, not as an official successor, but as the person positioned closest to every major change. That evening, I returned to the mansion and found Harrison sitting on the covered terrace overlooking the dark grounds. The air was cool, and the distant lights of the estate glowed beneath low clouds. I showed him the timeline. He studied it quietly before nodding. "You are finally looking in the right direction," he said. "Then Victoria replaced Andrew?" I asked. Harrison shook his head. "No, nobody replaced Andrew. That was the problem. The family created a system that pretended the original plan never existed." His answer only deepened the mystery. Before I could ask another question, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a copy of an old family photograph. I recognized several faces immediately. Eleanor, Thomas, a much younger Victoria, and Andrew, but something about the image felt different. On the back, someone had written the date and location of a private family retreat held more than 30 years earlier. Beneath that was a note in Thomas's handwriting. "Original succession meeting." My heart raced. The photograph placed all of them together before everything changed. Later that night, I showed the image to Eleanor. The moment she saw it, tears filled her eyes. She sat down slowly and held the photograph with trembling hands. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she whispered words that changed everything. "Victoria did not start this." I stared at her in disbelief. Every clue seemed to point toward Victoria, yet Eleanor looked certain. She closed her eyes and took a long breath. The person who set all of this in motion was someone the family trusted even more. Then she opened a drawer beside her chair and removed a sealed file bearing a single name on the front. Thomas. The file Eleanor handed me contained correspondence spanning nearly 3 decades. Letters, internal memoranda, legal opinions, meeting notes. Together, they revealed something none of us had expected. Thomas had not simply witnessed the transformation of the Harrison family. He had helped design it. The documents showed how succession plans were revised, how trusts were reorganized, and how critical decisions were presented as routine legal adjustments. Victoria had benefited from the changes, but the architecture behind those changes belonged to Thomas. He had understood the system better than anyone. He knew where influence could be hidden and where questions would never be asked. 2 days later, the entire family gathered once again in the great dining room of the estate. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. The chandelier cast warm light across the long oak table. Everyone was present. Victoria sat near the center as she always had. David looked exhausted. Isabel remained composed. Eleanor appeared nervous but determined. Harrison occupied his familiar seat at the far end of the table. Thomas arrived carrying a leather briefcase. For years, this room had been the center of family authority. That evening, it became the place where decades of silence finally ended. Harrison stood first. The room immediately felt quiet. Without raising his voice, he placed several folders on the table. Thomas looked at them and seemed to understand exactly what they contained. No denial appeared on his face, only resignation. One by one, the documents were opened. Original succession records, trust amendments, private correspondence, evidence showing how the family's future had been redirected after Andrew disappeared from the center of the inheritance structure. Nobody argued with the facts. Nobody could. Victoria remained silent longer than I had ever seen before. David stared at the papers as though reading the history of a family he no longer recognized. Eleanor finally closed her eyes with visible relief. The burden she had carried for so many years was over. Then Thomas spoke, not to defend himself, but to explain. He said the family had become more concerned with preserving power than preserving truth. One compromise led to another. One decision justified the next. Eventually, the original story was buried beneath a new one. When the meeting ended, no dramatic victory remained. No single person walked away with complete control. Instead, something more important happened. The illusion collapsed. The family finally understood that its greatest threat had never come from competitors, outsiders, or changing times. It had come from years of silence. As everyone slowly left the dining room, I looked toward Harrison. For the first time, he seemed at peace. The truth had survived, and with it, the possibility that the Harrison family could finally build its future on something stronger than secrecy.